Hi, this is Alessio. Hope you're well, and welcome to a brand new update on Bitcoin. So in today's video, I just want to give you an update on the Bitcoin situation today after this breakout that we had just recently above the trend line. So we'll take a look at this chart and this chart as well, and also this chart you're seeing here today, which is going to be quite interesting. Okay, let's go back to the chart of Bitcoin here. Now we'll come back just in a few minutes to this particular breakout chart. Let me first of all just say that obviously, as I mentioned in my previous video update, I was not expecting this particular breakout above the trend line. So again, in my previous video, I expressed some concern and some doubt about the odds of breaking this particular trend line. But of course, Bitcoin did that. And as a matter of fact, just recently, I think it was today, we hit the highs. We came very close, as a matter of fact. We came very close to hitting the highs of 2019, just about there, depending on the chart you're watching there, by the way. So that's all good. But here's the bottom line. The question is, what does this mean for Bitcoin now that we've broken out above that rising trend line and this rising pattern that you're seeing here? First of all, I want to bring this to your attention. There have been several things that have not lined up on my charts. For example, you may recall from an earlier video, I expressed some concern that Ethereum was not leading. And you can see even today, Ethereum is still not leading and is still below its resistance of 420. You may recall in a previous video, I warned that I want to see Ethereum leading us above 420. And so far, Ethereum has not managed to break this 420 level. The second thing is the stock market, which has been quite concerning and worrying. Take a look at the stock market futures, the S&P futures, and today, as a matter of fact, it managed to drop even further lower. And you can see today, volatility is going through the roof. This is the volatility index, the fear index, or VIX. As you can see, as a matter of fact, you may recall in a previous video, I said, look, the VIX could actually break above this channel pattern. And as a matter of fact, it skyrocketed today, as you can see there. So there's a number of things which are not lining up with the rising Bitcoin. Again, the falling stock market, Ethereum, again, showing relative weakness, and going back to the chart of Bitcoin, yeah, and also this. This is the correlation between Bitcoin and the stock market. Now, as you probably know by now, there's been a close correlation, a positive correlation between Bitcoin and the stock market until recently. But look at this. Mid-October, this correlation broke down. Okay, there it is. You can see back in mid-October, as Bitcoin surged and rallied quite significantly higher, stock markets did the exact opposite. Stock markets, as you can see shown in green, went down. So whenever I see something like this, I do pay attention. And there are two possibilities here. One possibility is it's a temporary breakdown in correlations. Okay, so maybe a temporary decoupling in this correlation between Bitcoin and stock markets. The second possibility, which I think is more likely, is that one of these charts, the stock market or Bitcoin, is lying to us. So they can't both be correct. It's possible that one of them is potentially lying to us. So either the stock market is telling the truth, or maybe Bitcoin is telling us the truth here. So I think we have to be patient here and see how this resolves itself. Again, it's possible, of course, it's possible the correlation maybe has broken down, but I think it's unlikely. Okay, let's turn our attention now to this chart here of Bitcoin and the breakout which occurred just recently. So there is the trend line, and there's our breakout right there, which occurred, by the way, yesterday. Notice today we're coming back down to retest that trend line right there, okay? So there's the trend line being retested today as I'm making this video, and there's the lows of the week. That's the lows we made on Monday. Those are going to be important levels going forward. But here's the thing I want to bring to your attention. This is a weekly chart of Bitcoin, okay? Now, look at the weekly chart, and depending on how the week closes, okay, we're going to have to be patient here, and let's see how the week closes. In other words, how this bar ends up closing by the end of the week. All right, guys, and I think that's going to be giving us a lot of information as we go forward. I want to explain to you one of the reasons why I don't like breakouts from these kinds of rising patterns. So when you see these rising trend line patterns like this, and I expressed to you some concern about these patterns, about these rising patterns and these rising trend lines. And I said to you in the previous video, look, I don't like to get extremely bullish when price breaks above a rising trend line and a rising pattern. Why? Because they don't have a happy ending. Usually, and statistically speaking, they don't often have a happy ending. For example, here's Bitcoin in 2016. I want to show you some examples of this. Notice in 2016, we had a rising trend line, and we broke that trend line here back in 2016. Now, notice we had some follow through for a bit on this weekly chart, but look what happened here. It came back, retested it, and then fell below it. Notice what happened here. Right here on this chart, after it pulled back to the trend line, it couldn't stay above it. Notice it couldn't stay above it and then fell below the trend line. By the way, the guys on the YouTube channel, Good Mythical Morning, have an interesting catchphrase. They say, dink it and sink it.
Dink it and sink it.
And here's the bottom line. What I like to see after a breakout, I want to see price coming back and, as the catchphrase says, dink it. And I want to see if it sinks it. Okay, so right over here in 2016, we came back to dink the trend line, but did it bounce? Did it go higher again? No. In fact, what happened was it went below the trend line and then it sank. Okay, so that was a dink it and sink it situation. Let's look at this over here. This is 2017 on Bitcoin. Again, notice what happened here. We had a trend line. So we have a rising trend line here. Okay, just draw that over here. And notice what happened. The price breaks above the trend line here, stays above it for a while, but look what happened here. Again, these kind of breakouts don't often, again, statistically, they don't have a happy ending. And notice what happened here. Again, a breakout and then fell below it. And here's the thing, guys. As soon as price falls below it and stays below it here, like in this bar, then you know things are not looking good. And you can see price then collapsed. So that was a dink it and sink it scenario. Let me show you an example where it actually succeeded. So not every single time something like this ends up in failure. For example, in 2013, we had a breakout above the trend line, as you can see here. It's a rising trend line, by the way. Now notice what happened next. We came back and we dinked it or retested it. So that was a dink it and then bounce scenario. So what I want to see in a situation here is a breakout, okay, a breakout, then a retest of the trend line, and holding above the trend line. In other words, I want to see a bounce above the trend line. When a situation like this occurs, like here, that increases the odds of a further follow through higher. But it doesn't happen often. Here's in 2013, 2014. Again, notice what happened. You've got a rising trend line, as you can see here, okay? And notice what happened here. This was a failure. Again, this is what I'm saying. Statistically, on the balance of probabilities, these breakouts from a rising trend line don't have a happy ending. They often fail. And in this case, it did actually fail. And you can see that was a false breakout that actually ended up going lower. All right, guys. So let's go back to our chart now on Bitcoin. Here's the bottom line. Keep it simple. I always say keep it simple, guys. Right now, price of Bitcoin, yes, it did break above it. All right. But notice we're not coming back. We're retesting the trend line. As I'm making this video, guys, right now, we're retesting that trend line. There it is. There's a trend line. There's a breakout right there. All right, there's the breakout. Here's the retest. So we're now dinking it. The question is it going to be a dink it and sink it, as Rhett and Link would say, or is it going to be a dink it and a bounce? If the price holds above the trend line, if it doesn't close below the trend line, and let me also mention, as long as it remains above the week's lows, that's the week's low right there, so the Monday lows. So I need to see the price holding above the trend line and above the week's lows in order for the bulls to remain in control. Okay, so again, as long as Bitcoin can remain above the trend line and the week's lows, bulls may have a chance to remain in control. But, and here's the big but coming now, if by the end of the week, okay, if by the end of this week Bitcoin has closed below the trend line and there's been no follow through, okay, in other words, if Bitcoin has managed to fail to stay above the trend line, okay, and fallen below the week's lows and closed below this trend line, if it's closed below this rising trend line, and again, remember, breakouts from a rising trend line, statistically, on the balance of probabilities, don't have a happy ending. They usually fail. They end up being false breakouts. So on the balance of probabilities, I think if by the end of this week, if price still remains below this rising trend line, and if it's below the lows of the week, then no, guys, in that kind of situation, when the price fails to hold above the trend line, that ends up being failure and a false breakout, and that actually increases the probability for a breakdown to support. And again, my higher probability scenario is that we're going to see a pullback in Bitcoin down to the averages, at the very least down to these averages you're seeing here in my chart. For example, the 21 here and the 34 moving averages. And again, look, I'm going to keep an open mind. I'm going to keep an open mind here. Let's see what happens here by the end of this week. Will price be able to remain above this rising trend line and above the week's lows? If it can do that, if it can, hold above the trend line and it can bounce, if it can bounce successfully above the trend line, then in that situation, fine. Maybe bulls will have some degree of control and push it back up again. But again, guys, based on what I've seen in the past, based on these kind of situations, when you see a breakout from, again, a rising trend line, I don't like these kind of breakouts, all right, because they usually and often fail. All right, guys, so my personal belief is, my personal hypothesis is that very likely these breakouts, because they usually fail, I think that on the balance of probabilities, we're probably going to see Bitcoin falling back to support and you start to pull back down to the averages. I think that's much more likely. But again, I'm going to wait for price to confirm that, okay? So I'm going to wait for price to actually confirm that. That is my hypothesis at the moment, but I want to see if Bitcoin will confirm it, and let's see where Bitcoin is by the end of the week. Is it going to remain above the trend line and above the week's lows, or is it going to be below the trend line and below the week's lows? All right, guys, so let's just be patient and see what Bitcoin does over here. It's going to be very interesting. All right, guys, before I finish the video, I just want to say my good friend and fellow trader, Charlie Burton, who, by the way, is a fantastic trader. As I mentioned before, if there's one person whose judgment I trust, it is Charlie. And Charlie has actually launched his own signal service. And Charlie has actually made a video for you which explains how his signal service works. So if you haven't seen the video, go to this link you're seeing here and check out the video. And if it's something that appeals to you, you can subscribe. And by the way, you can also use this promo code BRAVA1 to get a 40% discount on Charlie's signal service as well. All right, guys, so the video to watch for Charlie's service is right there. And as I'm sure you're aware, trading involves a significant risk of loss. So please do not over leverage and always use a stop loss. Thank you very much, and bye for now.